Willkommen, meine Damen und Herren. Ich freue mich, dass Sie so zahlreich erschienen sind zu dieser Diskussion Orientierung, Werte, Hoffnung, warum Europa seine Werte wiederentdecken muss und wie man das schaffen kann. Ich freue mich sehr, vor allem im Namen zweier Gastgeber. Der eine Gastgeber ist...
Gentlemen, welcome. We have first the Grand Master Karl von Habsburg of the Order of St. George. Cordial welcome. And we also have Professor Franz Schausberger, our second host from the Salzburg Europe Summit. I need to introduce him. He is also, of course, the president of the IRE, the Institute of the Regions of Europe. Cordial welcome to you as well. But since everyone is up here on the panel already, I will present the individual speakers after the keynote, and I'm so happy to see that we have so many outstanding people here from culture, politics, science, and research. This would not be possible if we were not supported by economy. And so our thanks go to two people, Markus Bürger, head of Leopoldstein Castle, and Andreas Schweitzer. He also lends us his support. He is the founder of Artis Trade Invest. Thanks for your commitment and support. If we see Europe as a house, we have four pillars: family, municipality, region, and EU, and all the four carry the foundation of community. And if everyone does what they can do best, it's a stable house. But such a house has some neighbors, can't stand alone. There are some neighbors who want to come in, like Moldova. We are waiting for the presidential elections outcome today, pro or contra EU. We will see what kind of government it will be. Georgia wants to join, Ukraine as well. Then we have the associated neighbors like Norway and Switzerland. Then we have complicated ones like Turkey. And we also have Russia, for instance, warring neighbors. And then outside of them we have some friendly, like Canada or Japan, and they also mirror us back what we do for them, and the US play a specific part, closely linked to the EU. And you know that with today's president, who pursues his own agenda, it's indeed a major challenge. And why then does the Order of St. George deal with Europe? Why is that such an important topic for the Order of St. George? This will now be explained by Vinzenz Stimpfl-Abele, the Procurator of the Order. He will tell us whether there are some role models where we say, here we can unite Europe, can make Europe stronger, and it goes across identity and others. And Vinzenz Stimpfl-Abele, a cordial welcome now. Thank you very much. Your Eminence, esteemed Grand Master, dear ladies and knights of the Order, distinguished guests, and of course esteemed panelists. I'm convinced that some of you may be wondering why the Order of St. George is helping to organize the Salzburg Europe Summit, and welcome Claudia Reiterer, who has just asked the same question. Why do we help organize the Salzburg Europe Summit, this event here? And what an order of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine has to do with the topic of Europe in the first place? Well, the explanation is simple. As emperors of the Holy Roman Empire and Austria-Hungary, and as kings of Germany, Spain, Hungary and Bohemia, the Habsburgs not only shaped European history for centuries, but also remained committed to Europe after the end of the monarchy, influencing its development to this day. For instance, Otto von Habsburg, from the outset, warned of the risk he saw in the arbitrary borders drawn after the Second World War. And it was also he who, early in the 90s, in the plenary room of the European Parliament, insisted on the famous empty chair as a symbol of the countries occupied and oppressed by the then Soviet Union, and spoke of the colonization of part of Europe by the Russians. So indeed history seems to repeat itself. The historically significant pan-European picnic in 1989, which heralded a true turning point, was his initiative. And many of you might have seen the video. Otto von Habsburg was one of the very few who, as early as the beginning of the 2000s, warned urgently against Russian President Vladimir Putin, who at that time still seemed quite harmless and was courted by many, not only in Austria. His son, Karl von Habsburg, our Grand Master, is also a passionate European. Like his father, he was a member of the European Parliament and continues to work with incredible energy and impressive competence for a Europe that does not forget its core values. So it comes as no surprise that he is now fighting on all fronts for a free, independent Ukraine, precisely because he has taken up the cause of freedom and independence in Europe. No wonder, then, that when these two personalities reactivated the Order of St. George almost 20 years ago, they gave our community a strong European orientation. This is also reflected in our name, Order of St. George, a European order of the House of Habsburg-Lothringen. Europe is therefore in our genetic code, and we strive for a strong, proud, and diverse Europe. A Europe that is as aware of its shared history and the lessons to be learned from it as it is of its fundamental values. Which very often are not given their dues. When we discuss today why Europe must rediscover these values and how this can be achieved, this is not only one of the core issues of the Order of St. George, but also probably the most relevant question for the future of our Western world. Yes, I am deliberately speaking of the Western world in the spirit of Otto von Habsburg. For when we consider the dangers, problems and challenges, but above all the potential and opportunities of our Europe, and in particular the European Union, and this is not being dealt with often enough, we must be aware that, as Regensburg Bishop Rudolf Vorderholzer succinctly put it, there can be no other viable bond than the Christian faith to hold a united Europe together, and that in a sustainable manner. The reality, however, is that we are witnessing Europe increasingly losing influence, significance, weight, and, yes, even respect on the international stage. There is certainly no trace of EU-phoria among citizens and many politicians. Some even speak of decline, and some are trying to talk up the end of the EU as a project for the future. Under the circumstances, this assessment seems quite obvious. From very different approaches in Europe to what democracy and the rule of law mean, to the massive crisis of the European social model, to the threatening demographic development, there are good reasons for concern, pessimism, and criticism. Even the renowned Cambridge historian Christopher Clark, a proven specialist in recent European history, states, and I quote, in a recent interview, "Europe is facing a severe test, an acid test." But is this a current development, a result of recent mistakes alone? Is it really as bad as it seems? More dramatic than ever before? Some time ago I came across the book Europa in Niedergang, Europe in Decline, by French political scientist and sociologist Julien Freund, who was already examining the phenomenon of fragmentary decline more than 40 years ago. He defines fragmentary decline as the gradual loss of the characteristics that define a culture. And let me repeat this so that we really understand. As the gradual loss of the characteristics that define a culture. He recognized this in the developments of the disintegrating monarchies of Europe, as well as in those of the New Europe, as he called it. And, to be honest, this cannot be completely dismissed, for we are experiencing a Europe of contradictions and inconsistencies rather than a community of values. From the outset, the EU has been referred to as a union of values, but this obviously meant mainly economic values. How else can we explain the fact that politicians, under the banner of fighting inequality in society, seem to be increasingly losing their sense of proportion and purpose, opening the door to egalitarianism and thus permanently weakening our resilience? How else can we explain the fact that for decades migration has been seen as a noble European duty, while the willingness to integrate has obviously been considered only as a nice to have? How else can we explain that, under the guise of pacifism, a false pacifism in my opinion, quite a few people continue to preach peace at any price, thereby relativizing or even tolerating war, terror, violence, oppression, and intimidation on the part of autocratic powers? And how else can we explain that many politicians, depending on their ideological affiliation, have promoted or at least tolerated the fact that over decades the course has been set to transform a meritocracy in which people are willing to get involved, create something and take responsibility, into a society of suffering, which largely grumbles and is dissatisfied, wanting more and more for less and less? How else can we explain the fact that politicians constantly refer to responsible citizens, but at the same time increasingly regulate away the space for individual freedom, which requires responsibility and a sense of responsibility? Incidentally, this Europe of contradictions and inconsistencies has long since taken its toll on the perception of the EU from the perspective of its citizens, for in most cases it appears to them to be either too powerful or too powerless. In the first case, it is too far removed from the individual, their homeland, their hopes, concerns and fears. In the second case, too divided, too dependent on the US, and therefore susceptible to blackmail, too weak to defend itself in times of war. Both, ladies and gentlemen, create distance, not closeness, and disappointment instead of identification. This distance and lack of identification are fertile ground for nationalism, extremism, division and radicalism from both the right and the left. At this point I would like to clarify something. I am not interested in EU or politics bashing, but criticism must be allowed, especially when something is extremely important and close to one's heart. Therefore, in a discourse on Europe and the EU, it is essential to allow criticism and take it seriously. On the other hand, it is extremely dangerous to dismiss constructive criticism with the deadly label of anti-European, because that is grist to the mill of the renaissance of nationalism that we are tragically experiencing at the moment. But back to the question of why Europe needs to rediscover the values. Let me try to give a double answer here. Only values and traditions can create lasting identification. And identification is what it's all about. What is missing and what will probably the most important factor in the success or failure of Europe's further development and a key element for the future of the EU. To avoid misunderstandings, by values I do not mean the ideologically prescribed dance around the golden calf of zeitgeisty pseudo-values, from an increasingly exaggerated gender religion to an ever more inflated cult of diversity. the highly problematic cancel culture to the sometimes severely exaggerated political correctness, to name just a few examples. These prescribed ideological set pieces not only irritate people, they also increasingly polarize a society that is already drifting apart. The result is dramatic. Europe and the European Union are hardly in a position to develop an identity with which the majority of citizens can and want to identify. But that is precisely the crucial point, because only identity can create a lasting sense of belonging, ensure cross-border understanding and genuine supranational solidarity, and thus, again, substantial European resilience. In his book Die Seele Europas, The Soul of Europe, journalist and author Stefan Bayer describes identity as a synthesis. I quote, "In the coexistence of different peoples and ethnic groups who are determined to no longer allow themselves to be played off against each other, in the coexistence of people of different faiths, origins and languages, in the commitment to the highs and lows, the paths, wrong turns and detours of one's history, but a synthesis, however broad and comprehensive it may be, cannot encompass everything. Identity always also means demarcation." End of quote. Identity always also means demarcation. How true! And this is precisely where politics at all levels, but especially at the European level, has a huge problem, as one gets the impression that it is increasingly less determined by values and attitudes and more by ideologies and sensitivities. And the fear of precisely these. Yet Europe has every reason to show self-confidence, but that presupposes that we are truly aware of the European self. But what is the core of European identity? Is it its religious roots? Is it its impressive European philosophy? Or perhaps its significant European legal history? Pope Benedict XVI answered this question around 15 years ago in his highly acclaimed speech to the German Bundestag as follows, quote, "European culture arose from the encounter between Jerusalem, Athens and Rome, from the encounter between the faith in God of Israel, the philosophical reason of the Greeks and the legal thinking of Rome. This threefold encounter forms the inner identity of Europe." Unquote. If we also consider that invented, artificially created political structures without the cohesion provided by emotional identification are inevitably prone to crisis and unstable in the long term, it becomes clear that this identity can and must therefore be an expression of the soul of Europe. If we put it beyond dispute, if we understand the values associated with it as the basis of politics, social and European coexistence, then and only then will we be able to take a stand. Then and only then will we be able to provide guidance. That is why we must rediscover and revive the soul of Europe. And the European Union must understand, respect and protect it. Protect above all. In this way, Europe can become a home on a large scale and a home for Europe on a small scale. This is probably the most important mission and greatest challenge facing the West. It is a challenge that politics and society will only be able to overcome if we do not fall back into the usual patterns of behavior. Because identity cannot simply be declared or decreed. It must grow from within. It is not enough to reach the minds of Europeans. It is also and especially about their hearts. In conclusion, I would like to return to Julien Freund, who, despite his critical analyses, was not an apocalypticist, not a prophet of doom, not even a prophet of Europe's demise. You might find this out when reading his book. He also diagnoses that, just as the decline of a civilization can occur at any time when it denies its values and loses its identity, such a development can also be stopped and reversed. In relation to Europe, The prerequisite for this would be a return to what defines us. In other words, an end to the self-destructive treatment of our own history, an end to the contempt for tradition that has become so en vogue in some circles, and, above all, an end to the permanent, ever-increasing relativization of European values. Ladies and gentlemen, I am deeply convinced that we must finally begin not only to accept or even endure Europe, but also to be prepared to take responsibility for Europe. This applies not only to politicians, civil servants, the media and opinion makers, but to each and every one of us. If we all work to ensure that Europe is based on Christian values rather than an ideological agenda, that it stands for family rather than zeitgeist, opposes the threatening trend toward centralism on the one hand and nationalism on the other with consistent subsidiarity, replaces aloof bureaucracy with service to the citizen, then, ladies and gentlemen, will we not only overcome the crisis, but emerge from it stronger and more mature. As Europe has repeatedly succeeded in doing throughout its history, we must work toward this with united forces. Viribus unitis. Thank you very much for this highly personal keynote. Values, hope, guidance. Where are we? What do we defend? Where do we go? These are the three values we keep discussing. This is to be a discussion. I don't want to ask the same question to all of you. If you want to come in, even if you are against, I can only invite you, and I hope that we have enough time for you asking questions. It's not a glass ball game where authoritarian systems win more and more ground, where democracy is under pressure, young people seek orientation. It's a discussion about European values, and that's essential. This is an intellectually honest discussion and hopefully also of practical relevance. Now I'd like to tell you who the partners here are. Professor Jan Peter Balkenende, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands 2002 to 10, Royal Minister of State of the Netherlands. He also teaches at Rotterdam Erasmus University and is an internationally outstanding expert, particularly in the field of values and guidance by values. Further, Bishop Bohdan Dzyurakh, Apostolic Exarch for the Catholic Ukrainians of the Byzantine Rite, a very important voice for peace and reconciliation. Professor David Engels, historian and philosopher, also a Knight of the Order like Mr. Balkenende. He works on the intellectual basis of Europe. Karl von Habsburg, lawyer, entrepreneur, Grand Master of the Order of St. George from 96 to 99, member of the European Parliament, President, Own Shield International to protect cultural property, and Grand Master of the Order since 2008. He works in favor of European integration and commitment. Professor Franz Schausberger, presented before, former governor of the land of Salzburg from 96 to 2004, and chairman and president of the Institute of the Regions of Europe, IRE. He's also a university professor for new history at the University of Salzburg. He's an expert of European integration and regional politics. And Professor Kristin de Troyer, a Belgian theologian working at University of Salzburg, Vienna, Atlanta and Salzburg. She works in the field of interdisciplinary education, theology, history and president. She will be Vice President of the European Academy of Science from October. Cordial welcome. let us get started with orientation or guidance. I think this fits nicely as Professor Schausberger, as the host of the Salzburg Europe Summit, should be everywhere at the same time, so he can only be with us early in this discussion, but this is not a disadvantage. The present events show us that we have a current threat by presumable Russian drones, which in the last few days were seen over European airspace and, for instance, hovered, like last night, above Denmark and there above the most important military base. They were also seen in Germany. Today also Norway said something before them. In Poland they shot down some, Romania and other places. And we could also say that these attacks also are an example of the subsidiarity dilemma, because that's too big for national walk alone reactions, but the reaction still is fragmented. My first question, and let me ask it first to Professor Schausberger. Christopher Clark warns against disruption and loss of unity, and he once said also that politicians more or less work like sleepwalkers, and there could also be something to this, because those Russian or presumably Russian drones, if they hover above critical infrastructure and are not shot down, that's also in question. The member states react differently, and so is that a lack of joint action of Europe, or is it just a certain wise reluctance to act in an overshooting manner? Well, I think we have to know that for a few years already we have been witnessing a new way of waging war, and in the past we couldn't even have understood that. The matter of drones indeed is something which is indeed recent, since the war in Ukraine, an attack against Ukraine. All the other influences, elections for instance, like what has happened in Moldova in the last few weeks and before even, and we are not at all prepared to all of this. And so I can only join in with Christopher Clark. We had invited him already and I listened to him repeatedly. He is indeed right. We work and act like somnambulists, like sleepwalkers, because I can only remind you of the question of the Crimea. The occupation of the Crimea, what was the reaction? It was lukewarm, half-hearted, and they just said, anyway, why let them take it? We have energy, but we neglected entirely the fact that something was developing which is disastrous. And I would say, before this round here, we spoke, for instance, about the population trends and so on, and the question also was, of course, why are there fewer and fewer children? And it was said, of course, that so many young people say, under these circumstances we don't want to have any children any longer, because it is not safe enough for us. But we were and are sleepwalking. We still do that, and I believe that even then we understood that it is a disaster. A country like Germany, for instance, does not use circumscription any longer. They say it's not necessary to have an obligatory army any longer, because the Americans will defend us anyway. Well, as long as there are reasonable people acting in US, that's of course okay. I don't say that in a scientific manner now. One has to say it clearly. If there is a an 80-year-old in puberty, this of course has a completely different impact than the action of reasonable people. And we have always relied on the fact of having reasonable people everywhere. And on the other hand, we have someone who is a murderer. We can't put it differently. During COVID, he also suffered from mental change and now marches against everyone and everything, and only provokes. And such provocations which we witness every day, they are crazy. And if politicians only focus on, for instance, transgressing borders and seeing what can be achieved, then it will not have any acceptable outcome in the long run. And we have to say that if we come back to the values are everlasting, and particularly those of the European Union, but they have just been reduced in importance in the course of the last 2 years. In society, within politics and so on, their weight has been reduced, or shifted at least. We have to understand this as well, and we will certainly revert to this point. We have always relied on that. We worked and acted like somnambulists, and this at an era where there were some member state governments in favor of the EU. My idea always was what to do if in some member states of the EU there are governments which are against the EU, or at least very critically minded. Then we lose our purpose or our end goal. And be it on the left, be it on the right of the political arena, we have Slovakia, we have Hungary as example, and some others. Then the EU can't act any longer, is not powerful any longer, and can't come to terms with this problem rapidly. Well, on Friday, the 8 ministers of defense had a meeting, countries bordering Russia and Ukraine, and they now decided a wall against drones. But it might take until a year before that can actually be operational. And here on Wednesday or Thursday, there will be an informal meeting of all heads of state and government in Copenhagen. Today, the German army was asked to assist them against potential drones. And the question is to you, Mr. Balkenende, is what would you do if you were in the shoes of Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark?
Well, I think I should speak English, because sometimes you're put at a disadvantage. But I guess I will be the only one who speaks English, so I'll try to continue in German anyway. This is an extraordinarily important question, and it's something to do with values. And I have to say that for some time now, I've had my doubts in terms of what Europe is doing. So we're talking to each other, and we're in Brussels or in London or in Paris, and we talk to each other. And then once a missile dropped on Poland, and then the question was, what's that? It wasn't a Russian missile, but anyway, all of a sudden we saw people were anxious. What's happening here? So I thought if it had been a Russian missile, then we would have had to say we don't accept that. And Franz, of course, I agree with you. We're dealing with an American president, and also Putin is a war criminal. And what's happening in Alaska, well, is getting a round of applause. What kind of nonsense is that? So I'm really concerned. And I think it's all something got to do with values. And of course, the Russians believe that they can go on sending drones. And I'm wondering, why is it possible that Putin and the others are to just go farther and farther? They think they can do anything. That's something to do with too many doubts. And I think if you're self-confident, if you say, this is the red line, this is where it ends, well, that would be best. But for that, of course, you need an orientation and values. We are fighting for our values. This cannot be done. So to say, okay, we'll wait another year, well, this is really incredible. You need self-confidence. Well, that's what has been missing, and that needs to change. In the beginning, Putin was an outcast. Only 5 countries once said, we are behind Putin. And the others said, well, okay, we're not going to say anything. But then there's BRICS, and the Secretary General of the UN is there. I can't believe it. And the fact that Putin is doing that, this is just an example. He thinks that I can do anything I want, and then he sees how far can I go with the European countries. It's a game that he's playing, and actually it's very dangerous. So that's the question that you've asked. We need to change this. We need more self-confidence here in Europe. We should say enough is enough. And I talked to the Secretary General of NATO, and years ago, when Russia started bombing cities in Ukraine, I said, well, this is not okay, and they're just ruining everything there. And we should say we are not going to accept that. We're not going to stand for it. But it just went on, and now we're seeing that Putin has more friends, he's organizing things, and he's playing with Europe. We need more self-confidence. And this has something to do with values. And I do hope that Mette Frederiksen should say, what are we talking about here? This is not just a tactical question, it's the matter of our future and our values. An existential issue. I once talked to Dutch people who, in the course of the Second World War and the fight against Nazis, well, they went to England, they worked with the Navy, and I asked them, were you afraid? And they said, if you opted for freedom and democracy, you don't know any fear anymore. Well, that was actually a miracle. And that's the kind of attitude we need now. That's the stance we need now. Karl von Habsburg, every 6 weeks you travel to Ukraine, to the Ukrainian front. You were there recently 3 weeks ago. And in the preliminary talk, you gave me the number of drones that shot towards Ukraine every day, and that bring death and destruction, and how far this technology has evolved, and that it's becoming increasingly difficult to build this wall against drones. Tell us more about it. Well, thank you very much. You mentioned that more or less every 6 weeks I try to go to Ukraine, and what fascinates me absolutely is that every time I go to Ukraine, I'm confronted with a new generation of drones. So it would take 2 years to develop a new generation. Now it just takes 6 weeks. So technology progresses incredibly quickly. And you can see what the impact is. On the one hand, I can see it owing to the fact that often the drones are not delivered to the front line. But what you see here is a 3D printer. So it prints out the corpus of the drone, then the engines or motors are put in, then the bomb or the explosive is put in, and then without 45 minutes it's up in the air and gone. So you need to look at the figures. So more or less we can say that every day, if we take both sides, the Russian side and the Ukrainian side, there's maybe 1 million drone starts. It's hardly imaginable. So you can see this. I was in Kherson a couple of weeks ago, and you saw that a lot of the drones are controlled through fiber optic cables to make sure that they can't be electronically disrupted. And wherever they're used, and Kherson is the Russian hunting ground for individual Ukrainians who are hunted on the streets, and I saw this myself, I had to run for safety as well. So these fiber optic cables are falling down, and then you walk on the street and it feels as if you were walking through grass, deep grass, because there's hundreds of thousands of fiber optic cables lying on the ground. It's incredible. And on the other hand, what you see is that there's a lot of fighting, like in the First World War, trench warfare. And what I saw was that some soldiers told me that what they use for the trench warfare is the axes. The bayonet no longer works because it's the guns are made of plastic and not out of wood anymore, so they use axes for close combat. So just imagine what this means if you fight for your own country, so you know exactly what you're fighting for and you're motivated. This is really admirable. It's incredible, this motivation. But anyway, they're using the axe. So, of course, you need to really come very close to your opponent, to the enemy, if you have to use an axe. So it's hard to imagine how this should evolve. Well, your father, Otto von Habsburg, in the beginning of year 2000, said that, well, he warned against Putin, and he put this empty chair there for peoples that have lost their rights, that have been disenfranchised. So who should this empty chair be there for? Well, of course, for me, for Ukraine. There's another number of cities. I think I'm a pan-European, so I think certain countries should not be told they're European or they're not. If a country wants to use European values as the basis, and if they feel they belong, well, like Georgia. If you've ever been to Georgia, you know that Georgia is a deeply European country in terms of its culture and its background. And often they said they don't fit in geographically. I think we should be open here. But of course the fight of Ukraine is an essential fight. And also the membership in the European Union is an essential membership. We've heard about big emotions from Professor Balkenende. What are you saying? What needs to be done if drones are above our heads every day? Well, in the area of technology, there's a lot more knowledgeable people than I am. I think our task is rather the defense of European values. Because the war in Ukraine, the war of Russia against Ukraine, is not a fight between two countries. It's a fight between two ideologies. For decades and centuries, we've developed values here in Western Europe, and with the help of North America, Japan and South Korea and others, we now have a set of values. It's the rule of law, democracy, human rights, market economy. So these are the values we stand in for, and we've seen them as being right. And after the Second World War, those countries that embodied those values were really successful. And that is an example that shows that, well, Putin is against these values. It's a criminal Russian government that's currently in power, and this is why it is so important that we uphold these values and support Ukraine, because they believe in those values in Ukraine, because they are oriented towards Europe and they have taken part in European history. I'd like to ask a question. I'm not a political scientist. I come from the Old Testament, the Hebraic Bible, and there are two things I keep hearing. Why have we become so dumb? How is it possible that we're not capable of progressing in the area of science, that we can manage drones and do something actively against those drones? So that's a question I can't find an answer to. As scientists, we have an obligation. We have a duty, and the duty is to make sure that Europe and the world becomes a better place. So why have we become so dumb? I'm from Belgium, so we also have a different dictator, namely Napoleon back then. But a little Napoleon or a little Putin sometimes meets his Waterloo, right? Or Waterloo in Flemish. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing, this narrative of fear, 4,000 years of literature. Now, if I start in the Middle East all the way to now, well, it's always about some kind of threat. How can we change this? Because it's not only fear, we need courage. And we still have not found the moment where we say we need a different attitude from politicians, from decision makers. We need a positive perspective. This positive perspective should be hope that they give us. Because Putin at some point will die, and even the 80-year-old American will soon die. So how is it possible how can we make sure that for the young people, for our youth, we can eliminate this narrative of fear? We need to change this. I'm always an optimist. I always see the good things in people. Thomas Aquinas told us that, an important person. So, fear and stupidity, where does it come from? To be brief. Yes, we'll come to hope. That's a separate issue. How to give hope, how to instill hope in our youth and everybody. Professor Engels, you spent 7 years in Poland. So you lived there and you felt that the threat was perceived differently there. The Baltic states and the Poles have always warned against Putin, and in the West it wasn't really heard. So how did you experience this? Or your thesis actually is similar to that of Christopher Clark, because you're saying you're seeing parallels of the decline of the Roman Republic. Yes, exactly. So thank you very much for the invitation. And after everything that's been said, there's very little for me to add. But yes, the perspective is, of course, a completely different one if you live in Poland, as has been the case for me, because we lived in Warsaw for a long time, quite close to the war front. We saw the flood of Ukrainians, Ukrainian refugees. A lot of our neighbors hosted refugees. There was an incredible solidarity of the Polish population. And then you feel the war differently. You feel its proximity. You feel the fear of people. And Poles have been afraid for centuries because there has been this separation and the division caused by Russia. And as somebody who was born in Belgium, and I'm now also teaching in the west of France, so I'm also seeing the situation as it is perceived in France. Well, the war is very far away. Everything that is behind Germany is almost like it's in Siberia. So it's too distant. Also, the names of the countries concerned. So there's a lack of interest that we perceive in the West. And I wouldn't even say that in Western Europe it's so much about fear. I think it's about the lack of interest, about the fact that it's none of our concern, none of our business. It's like in 1939 in an enhanced way, which is explained by the fact that these values we're talking about, all this Europe or the West, the Occident that needs to be defended, well, people don't see it like that anymore, or hardly anymore. So on the right-hand side of the political spectrum, we have a strong nationalism and sovereignism that doesn't want to deal with the EU concept. And also the values of the European Union are increasingly distant from its own roots that the founding fathers in the 1950s focused on, especially the Christian orientation and the various levels of European identity, but also the left side of the political spectrum. And in this entire war, they only see an interference of capitalist US circles against the brave states of the BRICS countries. So there's not a lot that remains in the end. And I think what's at the heart of this problem, and von Stimpfl-Abele also said it quite clearly, is a question of values. Who are we? What constitutes our identity? And I believe that this is where there's still shortcomings. This identity has become very weak. Unfortunately, quite often the various institutions don't promote these values the way they should be promoted. And it's just been said that it's not constructive values such as the Christian Occidental values, family, principle of subsidiarity, love of your home, focused on, or faith, hope, love, wisdom, justice, courage, wisdom, etc., moderation. No, it's not those values. And Phil Chesterton once said that the current crisis is due to the fact that we don't have too few values, but too many values. The Christian values gone mad. So there's a lack of a center where this system of values should be fed from, so that we have an overflow, a plethora of individual values that are idealized as such at the detriment of other values. I think that there's a crisis of identity, and this is why the actual fight should be to make it clear to people what unites us as Europeans, to what extent should a Portuguese express solidarity with a Pole, or a Norwegian with an Italian, or maybe with an Indian or a Nigerian. Well, not because we have something against other civilizations, but because it is there's things such as civilization or values. There's different systems maybe, but there should also be some degree of solidarity between those. And this civilizational solidarity between civilizations, well, unfortunately the European Union has failed to build this up. We focused on the markets and the positivism, natural law, traditions, and that unfortunately leads to a deficit in legitimacy. For some there's only the nation state, and for others there's only humanity as a whole. But there's something in between that is worth dying for, but hardly anybody knows this. This explains the disastrous results of the surveys. I believe in 2023, at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I think it was maybe just a bit more than 50% of those polled who would have been ready to go to war to defend a NATO partner. And that is a big problem. It's not about fear, it's about solidarity and identity. That should be the main task.
Love, hope, belief, of course, you have addressed it before. And as regards your profession, for you, these values are the most important ones. What do you think while listening to all of this? Well, first, good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for the invitation. What I feel in my heart mainly is compassion for the people in Ukraine. On the other hand, also my deepest gratitude towards all of you, because we are not alone, we are not left alone. No one leaves us behind. This is so important. It's important for mankind, it's important for us human beings, because being left behind, being alone, doubles the pain one feels, so to speak. And since early in this war, in 2014 already that was, Ukraine ran into major issues, and no one listened to the oppressed ones, no one wanted to listen to them. And when villages and cities were bombarded on February 24, a wave of solidarity nearly exploded in the entire civilized world, we might say, and this has given us hope. Because this indeed was a mutual encounter and hope. And we had rays of hope coming from Ukraine. We showed them that we would never give up our dignity, our freedom, and our home. But on the other hand, there were also numerous signs of commitment and solidarity from the West. And all these signs, all these concrete gestures, and all these highly efficient reactions helped us so much, because we spoke, for instance, about an acute problem, but then we had spontaneous reactions, and a very rapid one, which helped us so much, and we could breathe again, and we were relieved a bit, and we could muster new energy in order to bring up our common defense. This is why, above all, vergelt's Gott, thank you very much, and thanks to God also helping us to accept all of this and never stop fighting for our values. It's not only about a piece of land. It's not about a regional conflict. It's about, indeed, a conflict for the entire civilization. And we have to defend Europe in order to defend us human beings. Because in Europe, humanity has been attacked. And what makes human beings in Europe is exactly these values. One of the major characteristics of people is the ability to feel compassion. A lot was said about indifference, and this is a real danger, not only for Ukraine, but for any societies. Indifference destroys families, destroys societies. Indifference also destroys the total European architecture and community, and this we have to avoid by all means. And there are huge signs of hope in this respect, because we have not allowed indifference to paralyze us. And when thinking back of this solidarity with our refugees and the first days of this war, we all were shocked, we were dismayed, but never paralyzed, neither in Ukraine nor here. And a few days after the attack at the peace prayer in Augsburg, we said, I feel this pain when I see what happens to the Ukrainian people, but also solidarity, because Europeans, so I believe, will build up a new Europe, a Europe of values and not a Europe of interests. And this is what I said then. And I believe, furthermore, I believe still, that these signs of hope are clearly present. Europe is being born again under horrible circumstances of this war against Ukraine, but this is indeed a war against European values. And my last word, indifference. Why? What is that about? The activists of the Revolution of Dignity in 2013 and 14 at Kiev wrote on the walls of buildings in Kiev, "Indifference kills." What they meant was that more and more people should take to the streets in order to peacefully protest, in order to defend their freedom and dignity. But I would say indifference not only kills, meaning that because of our silence, innocent people are killed in Ukraine and everywhere in the world. There are many dictators condemning and destroying human lives. Indifference kills, in particular, something human within myself, and that's a real tragedy. And this we have to avoid by all means and on all levels, political, educational, social ones, and in particular also spiritual and church-bound values. We are already in the value discussion, but one thing I'd like to hear from you, in spite of everything, we have to deal somehow with Trump and the US. And Angela Merkel in her biography wrote, when in 2017, before the G20 in Hamburg, she spoke, before that Trump had said goodbye to the climate agreement, and she had gone to the Pope Francis, and he asked him, how can you deal with someone who has so fundamentally different values? And the Pope said, bend, but never break. Meaning still keeping up dialogue, but never giving up. But now he's in his second tenure, Trump, and how should international politicians deal with this erratic, nationalistic, protectionistic president? an impossible question. I knew it. If you ask me what was your best geopolitical moment, I would always say that was in March 2009 in London before the G20. This was a time of crises, but still we said we have to work together, and that was kind of us saying we have to understand how awful the situation is, and we have to find a common solution. This was highly positive. If we compare this to what is happening now, it's actually impossible. The question is, you can also try, of course, to stay passive, but this is of little avail. The question is rather, can we have a different kind of discussion? Because if it goes on like this, we would never have a solution. And what keeps me busy is, what are we talking about? I was in the US as the head of a Dutch group. I was in Washington. The Americans elected him, that's clear. But I actually was quite worried as to the checks and balances and the countervailing powers. And this is an immensely important thing. It is very bad what is happening now there in the US, and so I believe it is necessary to speak about values. I'm sure that here we speak about this. I mean, 2004 we had the EU presidency, and we organized a series of conferences about the Europe of ideas. The question was, when are we Europeans? What keeps us together? But this has never been done now. But the Austrian presidency with Wolfgang Schüssel and others did the same thing. It was an attempt to speak about values. When I became Knight of Honor of the Order, I said I do that because I'm in favor of a united Europe. And so we can also try to speak with Trump about what is actually essential. But I believe this would not get us anywhere. If we see how he deals with certain topics and objects, that's incredible. I find it enormously difficult. And I believe that Europe has to take much clearer a stance. We have to make sure that we take the right measures, and we have to operate with more vigor. And now it's just kind of a mayhem or kerfuffle. We have to speak with a much more clearer voice. A much clearer voice. And when it comes to military affairs, for instance, we have our own lines, and we have to show more energy, I believe. And we also have to bring out clearly that it's a bit strange that we do not try to speak to others. One could do much more. We still depend too much on the United States. That's a huge risk. May I come in here? It is perfectly true what you're saying, but I believe in democracy, and I only hope that in November 26 there will be new elections, a third of the House, and I believe that in America as well one wakes up and that the checks and balances will be awakened again. Indeed, Liz Cheney, she once said, I hope that the Republicans will understand that sooner or later the thing is at its end. But what have you done, you Republicans, will be the question. In the New York Times, a few days ago, we read that Putin, for instance, spits into Trump's eyes, and he tells the whole world that it's raining. I'd like to link up with what Jan Balkenende said. But I also have to say honestly that we have to go one step back. I join what you are saying when you say that there has been a much better perspective for a good working together after the collapse of the Soviet Union and so on. And now, I believe, when being honest, we have to say that did exist, but also from the West, not everything was done in such a way that actually something good came out of it. I can only tell some minor things. I worked 30 years in the EU's Committee of the Regions, and we held many meetings and had negotiations also in the Baltic states, and that was about Ukraine also, of course. And it was not a topic at all, Ukraine and EU. That wasn't a topic, never ever, not even from the Russian side. But we always had an American sitting on our shoulder, and he always said NATO, NATO, NATO. And I then thought already, is that good now to go into this direction? This was the first thing I wanted to say, and it does not mean, it does not legitimize in no way what happened then. But maybe then some mistakes were made, and we as Europeans, we fully relied on the Americans and were fully on their side and did everything what they said. But we said, if there is someone who always says America first, I don't care about Europe, then we have a problem. And can I also add something briefly? Miss De Troyer said it. It's indeed about disinterest and indifference and not wanting to think thoroughly. And I believe with the square of distance from the people concerned, indifference goes up. The former ambassador of Lithuania to Austria is a very good friend of mine. He is just a few years older than I, so very old already. But I have to say, he recently sent me a picture. He is older than 75. He is prepared to fight. He has his rifle at home, and the Baltic states have been doing that for years. And we said, we just lean back and the Americans will help us. Of course, I'm reducing the story, but this is how it is. And you also said, and you also mentioned all these drones and so on. We are not at all in a technical position to shoot them down here. We cannot even do that. As you said, it takes, I don't know, at least a year before such a drone wall, anti-drone wall is built up. So we have to be realistic here, I would say. And then also, I mean, for many years, and please let me say that so clearly, for many years, we have not at all been thinking about cancel culture, wokeness, political correctness. Everyone spoke about these things and dealt with them, but we neglected that somewhere else things are completely different. And that there in Russia, they fight exactly against all these aspects. In so far, we have to see that it's a fight between different Weltanschauungs, different world views and concepts, and this we should never forget. Two short comments. First, as to the drones, I believe what we really have to say is, do we shoot against the arrows which are flying against us, or should we rather shoot against the archer? And I think it's the archers we have to attack, and the same thing goes for Ukraine. And it's essential that we now attack them and that we really go in depth also in Russia. And this also means, of course, that we say, yes, American and Ukrainian products. If today we only have 300 kilometers range for weapons, you can't win a war with that, that's clear. A war which is an all-out war from the other side. And the second one, when we speak about values, I believe that wrongly we always take it that values, of course, come natural, that we have deserved them, that everything is so nice and noble. But the values which our forefathers had developed and are a product of civilization after many, many decades, that we have to defend them every day. And if necessary, we have to also take to the weapons. And we are so happy that we have one land which now happens. And this also means that there is, of course, a difficulty where, with the distance to the fight, the understanding goes down. That's clear. But we, as Europeans, have to see that there is a certain ceterum censeo which is so important for me. We finally have to also say that we need a ministry of defense and not a ministry of war. Well, following the Procurator Stimpfl-Abele's keynote, what holds Europe together? Values or markets? Both, obviously, both. Because initially the values developed, and also from Middle Europe, Central Europe, I'm an enthusiastic Central European. And let me put it this way. The question was, what do we do now? The forefathers said we had a world war behind us and we want to create security. Could we do that then with the elephant in the china shop? Well, the creators of the European community, of course, then understood that it wasn't possible by so doing. We create common markets, a common economy, and I mean, just behaving like a bull in a china shop will not help. You said it, Vinzenz, if one has a friend, one has to be able to criticize it. I love the European Union, but we have to criticize it as well. That's clear. Some just do not work as they should. As to the question of Arbanzo, of course, with North America and also Australia, New Zealand and so on, we have many, of course, civilizational links. And we have an alliance which, of course, is so important. But I think, quite certainly, we also have to understand that we have Franz, then Trump, and then maybe also others. So everything is possible, and this means, of course, that Europe finally has to understand that they have to take their own stance. And for me personally, we have to say that approaches, ideas, like for Greenland, for instance, this would be a casus belli. But it means that we are not prepared to a casus belli against no one. Europe is weak. Europe has always relied on the support of the United States in an era where such partnership was not easy either, but worked a bit better. So the question is whether a big hegemonial power like the US will also still defend a number of smaller partners, or abandon them, so to speak, in order to enjoy a bigger partner. But we have to become more independent and autonomous. And I can only tell you that, for instance, our German friends for so many years normally also do not pay enough money into the NATO funds, and the Doppelwumms, as the Germans called it, rather went into some obscure aspects and not really into defense. And so what I see now in most European nations rather is the stance that one hopes that this war sooner or later somehow will more or less fall asleep, and then business as usual can be done. So I would say that no one understands how important all of this is, and I also do not see that it's the West against the rest. We see just now this association, these bonds between China, Russia, Iran and many others, and that's very urgent now. One cannot insist on it enough. We have to become autonomous again in this multipolar world, which it has become in the meantime. And such a preparedness is of course only possible. Preparedness for defense, that is, if people understand what they defend. One value is of course Christianity. It was it was party and conflict at the same time, and now we're having a paradox situation. Would Christianity, Professor de Troyer, unite or rather divide? Well, we can say that we have a Jewish Christian heritage. We have Caritas, we have education, we were always there. And in the last 20 years, we forget life sciences, more or less, and humanity. Now we focused on two small things. And please don't be angry here, colleagues in the room. The soft science more or less got lost, and we have to find our way back. And why is that so? This is so because education, and good education, is the only way towards real values. And how can Christian values be taught? How can personal unfolding be stimulated? Of course, partly we are distributed, that's clear. It would be strange if we were not, but it also allows us some possibilities. So for me, if 2 or 3 are in a room, then there are 4 or 5 opinions. At least in the Jewish world, this is how it is. And this is good, because it's not a, how should I say, it's not a separatedness. We have different perspectives, but the perspectives all rely on the same thing, because we all have what was mentioned before, this link between what is called Jerusalem, Athens and Rome. For me, Jerusalem is Christian Jewish thinking, and philosophical thinking is not only the one of the then Greece, but you only have to read what Kant wrote in his philosophical work about this. So then there's the influence of Roman thinking, and this is our culture. Otherwise we wouldn't be called Europe. We have to understand that there were 3 different traditions, but where do we still impart this? Where do we still say that all of this is important? Are our universities still following basic research so that we do everything so that people can think autonomously? And this culture of fear and negativity, in order to take this away, we have to go back to the basic and core values. And these, in our culture, be we happy or not, are Jewish Christian values. But we actually have forgotten to integrate these values into all our culture. This is something we just don't do. When we speak about values which should be rediscovered, it means that they still exist. I said it before, and I think we have to understand that God's Spirit works in Europe, particularly where there is most pain. There, not only human suffering is crying out, but we also hear the godly voice, a voice which calls us upon change. This means metanoia, and this means conversion. We have to convert. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I believe it just happened too fast in Europe that we believe everything will work out nicely and we can focus only on business and on trade with the former Soviet Union and so on. I believe that today we learn the consequences of the many mistakes which were made. It has been said before, we have to learn from our own mistakes. Ukraine unfortunately have to pay now for these mistakes, but Europe pays as well in a different way. So in my mind at least 2 or 3 errors were committed. First, by mistake one believed that it is sufficient that there is no more Berlin Wall. And all of a sudden the people behind the wall would be democratic, full of initiative and could live freely. That was an illusion, because if a person becomes hostage to others, and that were entire peoples in the hands of totalitarian communistic regimes, and during many years they remained in captivity. When they come out, what do we do? What do we do, for instance, with the freed soldiers and civilians? We study them mentally, physiologically, spiritually, because these are the people suffering, the blessed ones. These are the ones who suffer the most, and one should help them find their internal integrity. And this also provides and calls for recognition of crimes committed. It also means that one has to understand how one can repent and not repeat the same mistakes. Second mistake, unfortunately, the bloody heritage of communism was never done away with. One speaks about the bloody heritage of Nazism, and that's now a matter of the past, hopefully, but the same thing was never done with communism and Marxist ideologies, and so many people fell victim to these. And the third mistake is to think that the formula can be applied Wandel durch Handel, change by action. In Ukraine, and the ambassador will know, one says, you can feed the wolf as long as you want, but he will always look towards the forest. So a wolf can never turn into a sheep. So also after the war we have to see how we can help the Russian society to repent and to understand, and then there can be reconciliation in Europe. We have to keep time, and I would definitely allow you to ask some questions in German or in English. So, hope. Let us then maybe end on a ray of hope, what can inspire the next generations. I know how it is when I sit there and want to ask something. So now we have so many questions, and please tell us briefly who you are, what you do, and then ask your question. Please, short. We collect a few. I worked in Ukraine during 16 years until early in March 22. On Wednesday this week, in the festival of the town hall invited by Mayor Ludwig in Vienna, I organized a large Ukraine symposium, Ukraine in geopolitically turbulent times. The topic was a geopolitical one, the same like here. In 2002, during his first state visit to Austria, I met Putin in the diplomatic défilé. I shook his hand, and like your father Karl said, one has to look him into the eyes. What is that about? We fight a machine, someone who has a brainwash. A machine who thinks rationally, and we have to understand that. And in the symposium this week, one topic was addressed. If we do not understand Ukraine now as Europeans in Ukraine, and if we do not give them enough support, then probably we have to act against the Russians and fight on NATO territory, and that's a major point. Ian Bond, Center for European Reform, London. Ambassador Kimenets, Your Excellency. Good evening. I'm Ambassador of the Ukraine. Thank you very much for your discussion. Not very often, but sometimes you keep hearing such a critical and courageous reaction. So congratulations. I don't have much time, I understand, so just two things. First, you can discuss quite long what can be done. One thing is obvious. Values. There are values, you just have to defend them now. So they are defended like is shown in Ukraine. And this is why maybe we don't discuss how Ukraine can be funded with financial assistance. That's an investment also into Europe's defense. Because as we have seen also 2 weeks ago, only 20 drones, and probably there were no drones, but rather a fake. And in Poland, they tried to stop them by conventional aircraft. This is of course not possible. So financial assistance for Ukraine, because what we produce, we can only finance 40% of our production. This is the first aspect. The second one, and so important from my perspective, we keep speaking about this, sanctions in order to weaken Russia. Unfortunately, we are having a situation where Europe and the EU finds it more and more difficult because sanctions are being blocked repeatedly, are boycotted, are evaded, and just to take the decision is one thing. Thirdly, same thing with the financial assistance for Ukraine. Still some money is frozen, and we know why. And the third topic is something which I'm missing here, probably not enough time, and that's disinformation. Disinformation ruins values, ruins Europe. My recommendation: stay courageous, and that's most important. 100 million people with economic development, everything is there. So be courageous, don't be afraid, and believe in yourselves. Thank you, Your Excellency. Russia presumably invested 200 million into disinformation in Moldova. We will see the outcome. Peter Jebesch, retired. Thank you very much for your explanations. I'm enthusiastic and shocked at the same time. What you have addressed is values of Europe. And this, I believe, requires more depth. What I'm missing a bit here is that we have to distinguish, I believe, between values, I'm even convinced, between values of today's youth and values of the elderly generation like mine. Because here, I believe, there are huge differences, and difference means that it's hard to act in a united way. And then no one spoke about the term of Vaterland, homeland. Is this a term we should not use any longer? Or should we tell to the young people that this still exists for the future? 3 things we've heard. Professor, first we speak about values. I have to say I'm more optimistic. When we speak about universities, we more and more speak about the question why we do what we do, not only what and how, but also the why. There are organizations saying what is the purpose of our action, and we speak about purpose more and more, and we speak more and more about values. I spoke to a Dutch operator, and he said, first chapter, first values, then vision. Values are so important, and this is why we are here. This has to be highlighted. Second, a book was published last week. You know it, Vinzenz, Capital is Reconnected Towards a Sustainable, Inclusive and Innovative Market Economy in Europe. You can download it free of charge. But why have we written this book? We said we have to think of a reorganization, of a repositioning of Europe. Second, we also have to think about what kind of economy we want to have. And third, what about belief? And I said these 3 topics actually have to be taken together on the basis of values. First, human dignity, then inclusion, then sustainability and co-creation. And we have learned that when we speak about these values, we have to be highly creative, and then we can live them. One has to be critically minded. That's also important. And we're speaking about highly complex questions. Russia, for instance, I had such discussions very often, but I did not believe that it was a major Russia. But I did not do that in 05 or 06. But one has to learn what actually took place. And that's horrible. And fatherland, of course, there is still a fatherland. There is still national aspects. But we know in Europe also there are different cultures, languages, and so on. But I believe that actually Europe has achieved a lot indeed. We have achieved a lot, and we can be grateful for having been so successful. And we have to still think of what the future of Europe can be. We had that in the 50s, we had it in the 80s, Europe 92, free flow. And now the only thing we need is, of course, a new narrative. We need a new narrative. I'm fully convinced of this. And then there are, of course, always jokes like in the Netherlands we have Catholics and Protestants. In the past, one said, if you have one Dutch guy, you have a Christian. If you have 2, you have a church. If you have 3, we have 2 churches. Yeah, fatherland, motherland, homeland, that's patriotism, of course, and this, of course, can be married with a common Europe. What is not is nationalism. Patriotism means that you respect also the patriots in the neighboring country. And my darling definition is, of course, love of oneself, of the like-minded, and nationalism is hatred of others. And second, as regards values, I really am not that optimistic. You cannot just say we defend our values, because in the meantime I'm under the impression that among European values in different countries quite different things are understood. And we have at least 2.5 states where, for instance, state rule of law, like Hungary, understands something different. Let's see what will go on in Poland. Let's see how the elections will be in the Czech Republic, and so on. And if then, of course, you want to do something together in Europe in order to, for instance, protect the rule of law, then we will run into trouble, because we cannot make it all of us together. This has nothing to do with values, but you just see we have now the 19th package of sanctions against Russia. So first I wonder, what did the first 18 packages do? And second, for weeks we have been discussing the 19th package of sanctions, and we don't know what will come out of it. But of course Hungary and Slovakia are against, so it will take another few weeks, and then there will be some half-hearted compromise, giving them something so that they agree, but maybe they don't even agree. So I'm not overly optimistic, because, as I said in the beginning, if in all EU member states we had EU-friendly, pro-EU governments, it would be easier, but we don't have that, and so we have a huge problem. Well, I can only link up here. Heimat, Europe. Europe has to become our homeland. And this is something which I don't see too much. My own relation to Europe is, of course, a bit different from others, because we are Belgians. And as Belgians, for me, Europe has always been my ultimate home. Not only Europe as a continent, but also this term of the Christian Occident. And this is, of course, difficult for people, for instance, living in the center of, say, France or Germany, as regards this Occidental level, and one has to work upon this, and that's something I'm missing very strongly. It does not exist at all, almost on the left or right, in the middle. Sometimes you think that Europe can be reduced to very general values, which we can find outside of Europe. It has to be said clearly to the Europeans that with the Japanese or South Koreans we share values like rule of law, like tolerance, and so on. And still, we have more things in common. Europe does not always mean humanity, and that's an important factor here. And you said, you mentioned the Christian tradition, not as something exclusive or something discarding others, but something which is deeply anchored within us, and without which the whole Occident can't be understood. So it is not possible that we are in a society where, at least in the impression of most people, Christianity is not positive any longer, but is more or less criticized and neglected by many. And if someone says now a crib, for instance, doesn't exist any longer, or the cross can't be hung on the wall any longer, then there is something wrong, even if in individual cases you might understand it. But that's a trend which is not okay. If it goes on like this, then indeed Europeans will not know any longer what makes them Europeans. As regards patriotism and nationalism, Franz, you have already said everything, so I have to link up with a different topic of yours. I'm a passionate fan of sanctions, but of course I share the regret that these sanctions are not fast enough and good enough, but we see how they take effect in Russia, and you always forget that sanctions are always something in the long run. There are no short-term sanctions, but long-term they do take effect. So be it the 17th, 19th or 21st package, I'm very much in favor of having these sanction packages, even with all difficult sanctions, do take effect and are important for all of us. They are of course too slow and not far-reaching enough. And the second point I'd like to speak to is disinformation. It's incredible if you just see in how far the airspace of information about Russia is completely mastered and dominated by their criminal government, because people always have to say, oh, Zelensky is so corrupt, his wife has the 35th apartment in Florida and the 17th Ferrari. All of this is what they say, but this should be studied, and my friends and I, we do enormously many studies, and I've never seen a single point where just one of all these things were correct. So you should really see where information comes from, and it comes always from Russia itself, with all those just repeating something which they seem to find in the West. But the fight against disinformation is as important as support to the fight itself. At the end, please give us a ray of hope for the youth. This is exactly what I wanted to say. We have so many young people. What can we do for our youth? That is, for the generation which is afraid. How can we change the narrative? And I believe, for instance, that university education, this is to be a precondition. Every student in Europe should have to go somewhere in a different country. We have Erasmus agreements. Every student can go everywhere for just one semester and come to know a different culture. This should become something compulsory, and only due to communication and exchange, if young people speak about it, can there be a new type of exchange. So for me this is essential. What can we do? And then research, of course. I really hope that research will remain the basis for universities, so that we have knowledge, so that we can still share whatever is important for a society. Without trust in science, there will not be any democracy. So please send your young people at least for one semester into a foreign country, somewhere in Europe, so that they get to know something else. And please, let's develop a narrative where everyone hears that it is indeed possible to still have hope, where we learn to share this compassion and these other perspectives, and so that we also see that what we are doing here always can only be something of a local nature. So I hope for a big world where the young people, the young generation, indeed learns something. So thank you very much. This is now a very nice final word. But as regards hope, viribus unitis, unitis, that was the motto of Franz Joseph, and the Danube monarchy, as we know, was a multinational field of experiments. What could today's EU learn from that, or would that be the motto of hope? Well, you can never, of course, transfer a system, but you can understand some elements which are positive. Let me just mention two. First, it's the fact of the Moravian Ausgleich in 1605. That was the first mechanism for different peoples on the same territory. It was a typical Central European Austro-Hungarian product, which then became a legal standard later for Galicia and other places, but due to World War I, of course, it was not taken, but it's still the basis for the living together of peoples and ethnic groups. The second one, I go much wider back into the Middle Ages. For instance, the Order of the Golden Fleece and its foundation. Philip of Burgundy indeed created an organization. He was so modern then, and he founded an organization where he said, I invite all heads of state and government, as we say today, of all the neighboring countries, to sit around the table with me, and I give them the most essential right, and that's of course war and peace. And if today I see the council, I always think back of the foundation of the Order of the Golden Fleece. So we can always learn from history. There are always such examples. Of course, you can also learn from negative examples. That's clear. There are many, and I'm not going to mention them because I will, of course, not criticize my ancestors. We started with drones, and I end with drones because they show that actually it's not about academic debates, it's about Europe's ability to survive in a dangerous world, and Europe indeed is fighting a paradox. We have to prepare ourselves for the future. In order to still be able to act, we have to find our soul again, and those presumable Russian drones show that in defense we have to redefine our values. And I would like to end on a thought which has accompanied us since Adenauer, and I think it fits nicely. European unity was a dream of a few, it became a hope for many today. It's a necessity for all of us. And I'd just like to thank everyone here on the panel and to you in the audience, all those who go to the reception. The buses are waiting for you directly here. Have I forgotten anything? And of course we are too long, but we started late, but I still believe, of course, within 90 minutes we cannot solve all problems, but there were some approaches. Even if you go home with just one important thought, it has been an important discussion. Thank you very much, and a very nice evening.